Hello and welcome to Your Library at Home. My name is Sam Hagan and I'm the manager of the library's public programming and awards team. I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging that we meet on country. I live and work on Gadigal land and take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present, and of course emerging. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal Australians who may be joining with us this evening. Welcome to another international instalment of the Bealeys Book Club. Really exciting to be here. Our guest is zooming in from the UK tonight. So early morning start for her, evening drink for us. In a minute, I'm going to hand over to Bri, but before I do, I'd just like to remind you that the library is currently exhibiting the 2020 World Press Photo Exhibition. Obviously, we're on site. And obviously, we also have a COVID-safe plan. So if you do want to come in, I encourage you to visit the library website to help you plan that visit. It is a free exhibition. It's full of absolutely amazing images from around the world. And I really encourage you to visit us. It will be finishing on the 18th of October. So you've got a couple of weeks left. But that's enough of the hard sell from me. I'm going to hand over to Bri. I'll be back soon to moderate the Q&A, but now, Bri, are you with me?
Good evening, I am. Hello, thank you, Sam. Good evening, everybody. Bri here, as usual. Welcome to my lounge room. I would like to acknowledge that I am on, of course, what always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Here in Sydney, that means it's Gadigal land. And when I say I acknowledge land, what I mean is that sovereignty was never ceded. We don't have a treaty. And I fully support the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I'm really thrilled that you've all chosen to join me for this Thursday evening. It is a special international B-list because the author, Rebecca Giggs, who is normally based in Australia, is in the UK at the moment. And again, as I often find myself saying, it's a silver lining of COVID that we can get incredible talent all over the world, wherever they are, in and through your screens to you. We're going to be talking about Rebecca's first book, Fathoms, which I just absolutely loved so very much. It is some of the best, if not the best, nature writing that I've ever read. And I loved it in particular because obviously the author cares a lot about whales. It was a whole book about whales, about so much more as well, obviously. But it's just that really special thing when you are reading something that the author truly cares about. You cannot help but be sort of infected by their enthusiasm and wonderment for the subject. And so I'm really thrilled to be able to welcome Rebecca Giggs. Rebecca is an author from Perth, which she also acknowledges is Noongar Whadjuk country. Her non-fiction has appeared in Best Australian Essays, Best Australian Science Writing, The Atlantic, Granta, the New York Times Magazine, and elsewhere. Rebecca's writing focuses on our connection to animals in a time of technological change and ecological crisis. Fathoms, the Orange Book about whales, is her first book. Rebecca, are you there?
Hello, Bri. Thank you for that generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I'm so glad you can join us still, even though you're sort of still stuck in London at the moment.
Yeah, hardly the worst place in the world to be stranded, but for the time being, we're in a different time zone and far from the sea, which really makes me pine for home at this point.
I wanted to open tonight's discussion, as I mentioned to you, about what's happening in Tasmania at the moment, because for anyone who's been watching or keeping an eye on the news here in Australia, there has obviously been this devastating mass beaching. And I'm obviously we're going to spend most of tonight talking about your book, but I was hoping you could describe what's happening there and how you respond when you hear news like that, now that you've written an entire book about these creatures.
Yeah, so I think this news story has really captured the public's imagination and attention. Something like 400 long-finned pilot whales have now stranded along the west coast of Tasmania. They've been stranding since Monday. I think there were 2 large batches, one after the other. And something like 150 of those whales have died, about 60 have been returned to the open ocean, and the others are suffering and declining along the coastline. When I hear a story like that, I'm reminded of similar stories from a part of Australia that my mother grew up in Western Australia, down on the south coast. The same species of whale, long-finned pilot whales, tend to strand there, and we've seen them in quantities as large as sort of 350 down in WA as well. But this is Australia's largest stranding so far, and it's drawn a huge number of volunteers down. It's obviously a very tragic moment when you see death on such a large scale, but nobody knows why these whales have stranded, particularly these whales. There are different kinds of scientific theories for it, but ultimately it's a mystery. And like many things about whales, it points us off in the direction of the deeper mystery of the ocean.
Your book starts with your telling of a single whale being stranded, and very much that seeming like a catalyst for your then, oh, forgive the pun, dive into this whole world. For anyone who hasn't read the book, can you talk a little bit about why that, I guess, set the scene of that particular event, and why that hit you hard enough to set you on the journey of writing this book?
Yeah, so there were two inception points for this book, really. One of them was that I'd helped out at a humpback stranding in Western Australia some years ago now, where a yearling humpback had drawn up on a sandbar. A yearling is not a big whale, it's about 12 meters long. And we managed to get it off this sandbar, and it swam out into the water, but it eventually returned and it re-beached much higher up on the sand, and then it started to decline and die. And so while I was standing in the crowd that came down to see the whale, I heard all these different explanations from people as to why they believed whales might strand. Some people said to me they thought it must have been savaged by predators like sharks or killer whales. Other people had an idea that it must be sick or hungry. Someone even said to me they thought whale beachings were connected to falling stars. And I guess I started out with that set of explanations and being interested in the ways in which they point to different kinds of causation in the natural world, the way we explain events in the natural world. But it wasn't until much later that a news story popped up around 2013 about a sperm whale that had died off the coast of Spain. It really caught my attention and kind of started me revisiting the notes that I'd taken back at that whale beaching. And the news story described a sperm whale, which is a much larger species of whale. It's the Moby Dick classic kind of blocky-headed whale, very much hunted in the 19th century. This sperm whale had washed up dead, but when biologists had done a necropsy on the animal, so humans get an autopsy and animals get a necropsy, they'd found within its stomach this bizarre medley of synthetic objects. They'd found coat hangers, bits of bedding, mattress springs, and then most strikingly, they found a greenhouse. So this huge tarpaulin with bits of flower pots and a spray container for a herbicide and bits of burlap all wound up together inside the animal's stomach. And to me, you know, I was born in the 80s. I remember those like faded bumper stickers you used to see that said, "Save the whales." I thought, you know, whales were this kind of like big token of the environmental movement in the 80s, and that we'd saved them, you know, like the conservation movement had been successful. But here was this icon from that era turning up with what to my mind is, of course, the most striking metaphor of climate crisis. So the greenhouse, which is literally the way that we explain the warming planet, the greenhouse effect, and this kind of nesting of symbols together, like if I'd put it in fiction, I don't think readers would have believed it. But it leapt out at me and it really brought me back to that story of the beaching in Perth. And I sort of was away at that point. Yeah.
I just want to remind everyone watching, I usually do this at the beginning, and for anyone who's new to the B list, at any time throughout our chat tonight, you can type questions into the chat box, and Sam will be keeping an eye on those throughout the event. And we are leaving, I promise I will try to do my best to leave a full 10 minutes for audience questions for Rebecca at the end. Something there were a lot of sort of sets of ironies in the book, or just sort of striking, like you said, striking metaphors. And one that really hit me was just how much the whales went, like whaling and the sort of materials that we got from whaling fed all of these critical stages of human industrial development, which then ironically allowed us to whale even faster and more aggressively. Can you talk about sort of, I suppose, some of the key, almost like industrial milestones in that sort of early stage of whaling, and then how that ended up sort of feeding back into the problem?
Yeah, I mean, this was, the striking lesson that arose from the process of researching whaling in the 19th and 20th century, that there is this kind of vicious loop that gets perpetuated in the way that, in the 19th century, our forebears were really never very far from products that had either been produced using whale oil or contained within them some element of a whale product. And in that era, that largely meant ballenes, which is sort of like it's like a fibrous substance that some whales have in their mouths. It's kind of like a mustache inside your upper lip. And whales actually use them to strain out the seawater that they take in to keep their little amphipods and fish and other prey that they eat. Anyhow, ballenes taken from the mouth of a whale were really like the thermoplastic of the time. They were remolded by steaming and by putting into hot water. And they became things as wildly diverse as the ribbing in women's corsetry. They went into hula hoops. They became parts of surgical stitching in the springs in watches. We have this expression to wail on someone, actually comes from the use of ballenes in the canes that were used as corporal punishment on children in schools during that era. So you have all of these different sundry products that are produced using whales. And then you have whale oil, which goes into the late stages of the Industrial Revolution. So it goes into machinery for metalwork and textile manufacturing. And it's also this amazing illuminant. It gets put into candles and into lamps, burning late into the night. And the important thing about whale oil is that it doesn't just, I suppose, become an industrial product. It actually changes the process of industrial manufacturing. So it's the inception of automation, because machines can now replace people because they're running smoothly and they're not heating up in the way that they used to. It's the extension of trading hours, because now lighting means that shop floors and factory floors can run well into the night. And so, you end up with the context of industrial manufacture being changed by this product. And it also goes into artistic mediums as well. It goes into printers' inks, it goes into photographic development processes. It becomes a emulsifier in painters' paints, so that, like, doing this research is almost like putting goggles on and suddenly you can see the whale everywhere. It's just littered through the history of human art, expression, fashion. It's in it's in divining rods, divine water. It's everywhere. So that's the 19th century. And then when we get into the 20th century, you would think that all these things would drop away, because plastic comes in, petrol comes in, they replace what all of those products we were using whale oil for. But paradoxically, there's this effect where, in fact, the fossil fuel age speeds up whaling, because it allows ships to go further and faster. It allows them to have refrigerators on board, and suddenly they can exploit whale populations that had remained untouched prior to that. And in particular, they can go after the biggest whales and the fastest whales, which whale fleets under sail never could, because they were too fast and too large. So then we hit the blue whale populations in the 20th century, those massive, the globe's biggest animal down in Southern Ocean, they start to collapse. The tiny little minke whales, which were way too fast to be caught before, are suddenly being pursued as well. And whales, their byproducts end up in luxury goods, they end up in medicines, and most spectacularly, they end up in the space race. So, you know, the whale oil, which is amazingly resilient to changes in temperature and pressure, because whales, of course, have to feed deep down under great pressure and in the very deep cold, is the perfect oil to put out into space to lubricate the mechanisms in the shutters on cameras, on satellites, and also in interballistic missiles. So yeah, there's this kind of huge, I guess the line in the book is that we live in the lee of whales in the same way that they live in our history as well. Their populations reflect our whaling activities, and our industry reflects an intimacy with the whale's body.
There's a line in the book where you question how we could go from killing so many whales, like hunting them, to then the movement of Save the Whales. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, that time of kind of radical transition?
Yeah, it amazed me how late in the picture this happened. So, you know, my mum's from down near Albany in Western Australia, where the last whaling station in Australia was operational. So she has living memory of going down and seeing these huge animals just being pulled up onto the forecourt of the whaling station, being flensed. She remembers a guy with an oar in a little rowing boat, like beating off the sharks as the carcasses were drawn up onto the Albany whaling station. So that was 1977 that it closed, before I was born, but, you know, still within the memory of many people. When Australia elected to stop whaling, though, it made a huge pivot conceptually, because the other English-speaking nations and developed world nations that had stopped whaling prior had done so on the premise that whale populations were collapsing, and like a fish stock, we needed to let them rebound before we then went back into exploiting them. Whereas for the Australian government, the move was made on the premise that whales were an exceptional animal. They were potentially sentient, intelligent. Whale science had revealed all these interesting details about whale society and about song. And so it was essentially a benevolent act to restrain ourselves from overexploiting this resource. And it was done on the premise that future generations deserved to live on a world that hadn't been denuded of its largest animals. And I guess for me, that was a real moment of hope, because, you know, at this point in time, in terms of our retreat from reliance on fossil fuels, obviously driving the large part of climate change, all those intractabilities, all those sort of the entrenched power that supports that industry, it can seem unfathomable that we could make such change. And yet here it is happening in the early 80s in Australia on a large scale with whales.
That was certainly the more I read about how incredible the global turnaround was in the attitude towards whaling. You had a line in there that it became like not a virtue signal, but it was like caring about the whales suggested that you were worldly, you know, that you had some kind of sense of like a global sense. And of course, I'm just reading this book, and the thing I just keep thinking about is like, well, how come the whole world was able to do that, and we have such stasis now? And so I was wondering, I mean, like a huge part of the problem now in terms of just this inaction on the climate emergency seems to be how it is politicized. But I feel like whaling was probably also politicized, that surely it was this sort of greeny left movement that there was a lot of sort of industrial skepticism about. Like, what, I guess, are there any sort of key things that you identified that worked for the turnaround with whaling that we should like learn the lessons from that history to try and repeat them now?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but when I hear about the impacts of, the large scale impacts of climate change, particularly when they're extemporized around nature, I find it very hard to feel. So I can understand the loss of the ice caps. I can understand, you know, the hole in the ozone layer, but they seem conceptual. They seem bodiless. They seem vast. Where the catastrophe is incredibly dispersed. It exists somewhere beyond my own kind of perceptual gestalt. Like I don't have the senses to actually taste what the ocean's increased marine acidification. I can't feel it. I can't smell it. And so the whale is this, you know, and part of the bit of the book really is to return the body to that crisis, because there was this mood on the beach in Perth, which is kind of difficult to put a finger on, but it was something like, here at last is the body to mourn. Like, here is the whale. We knew there was something going wrong out there. We knew that there was trouble in the ocean. We knew that, you know, there was transhemispheric dispersed plastic, and there was, you know, the melting ice caps, etc. But until a kind of creaturely body that we can empathize with sensorially arrives, it's very hard to kind of latch onto it emotionally. And I think we're in a really weird place at the moment where we lack a protocol to grieve the extent of the loss that we're experiencing. And so returning to look at the whale again, and really to look at, I suppose, you know, through a process of decomposing it, look at what's in its blubber, look at what's in its stomach, look at what's in its lungs, what is it breathing in? It kind of knits us into that worldliness once more, because to be anti-whaling in the 1980s was to be against whaling fleets and against whaling governments. To want to save the whale now means that you are implicated with the world's weather patterns. You are, you know, how you use plastic is relevant. You are also, you know, you're in connection with many more organisms than those that we love, because of course the whale is dependent on different kinds of food webs and ocean ecologies more broadly. And so I wanted to like bring the whale up to date to some extent and bring it back into those conversations, so that we have bodies that we can think through, and we have sensitivities we can think through, which is one of the great gifts of animals, that they can give us the opportunity to think about change and perceive change through a reality other than our own.
Can you explain what is biophilia?
Biophilia. Biophilia is a term that was coined by a very famous American biologist, E.O. Wilson. E.O. Wilson had this idea that humans were born hardwired to love nature. And his grounding for that was that, you know, babies often move in the direction of plants and animals rather than inanimate objects if they're given the choice. And so he thought, you know, there was something in our sort of factory settings that meant that we were predisposed to want to protect nature. And this was what gave rise to so many different origin myths and cultural histories around the natural world. And so in a chapter in my book, I wanted to think about this question of biophilia, which was a 1980s idea, but bring it into dialogue with the ways in which we encounter nature now, which is increasingly through the digital world. And I very much, you know, a lot of natural history writing, a lot of nature writing disavows the digital and wants to have this sort of ecstatic experience of nature, you know, wandering around American national parks or in European mountain ranges. And I just felt like there was something missing in that. And I wanted to kind of consider the ways in which most of us encounter the natural world now, which is mediated through the image and through digital culture. And so, yeah, I was kind of looking at the ways in which our love for nature is knitted up with grief in this day and age, and what that might mean for a kind of, like we care so much we can't stand it. We love things too hard now. We get in an attempt to kind of personalize our grief, we can sometimes harm nature by becoming too cloying and getting all over it.
There was this line you had in there about that, like, keeping our distance no longer amounts to care. But then also I have in my notes that one of the other sort of dualities or ironies that I really picked up on was how we seem, with the whales in particular, it's like we got more obsessed with them the closer they came to extinction. And this kind of irony that then we put them in zoos and like tried to get closer to them and tried to sort of understand them more, but that like all of the ways we keep them in captivity is so awful. And one of the most affecting lines I found from the whole book was you wrote that if we go to nature to settle our minds, it should come as no surprise that taking animals out of nature unsettles theirs. Can you talk a little bit about the whales that are in captivity, and maybe explain the example of that orca that ate the stones and how we so obviously sort of know so little still about these animals that we keep in captivity?
Yeah, there's this sort of insoluble tension in Fathoms, which I never managed to kind of reconcile, between wanting to respect the kind of alien intelligence, the otherness of whales, the possibility that they have cultures and languages, and I guess preserve that sort of unknowability, that evasiveness, and at the same time wanting to recognize that surely, you know, the impacts of human culture on whale kind, particularly those animals that are kept in captivity, have psychological dimensions to it. And the example I give is of an orca that ate something like, I think it's about, well, it's a weight equivalent to a washing machine's worth of stones off the floor of her sea pen when she was kept in captivity. And, you know, no animal eats stones of their volition. They don't mistake that for food. But throughout the book, there are all these things where like you're wondering, like, how does a greenhouse get between a whale and the world? Like, how does a whale mistake a greenhouse for food? How does a whale in captivity start eating geology, rocks? It's there's something there about the psychopathology of the animal. And I guess I wanted to open that possibility while not kind of like getting really anthropomorphic and you know, giving human attributes to whales where it's not merited, because the science says, you know, that these are intelligent animals. They have brains that are partitioned into hemispheres like humans do. They have many of the same neurons that we use for language and for even for empathy. They have something called a mirror neuron, which is quite rare in the animal world. But we cannot understand a whale's perceptual reality. We can't really understand a whale's social reality. Yeah, so I mean, that those whales in captivity, I think, is like is the simplest thing to solve in the whole debate. Like, we shouldn't be keeping animals at large, particularly not herd animals that are, you know, move in large herds, in captivity. It changes the way they communicate, it changes the way they eat. And at the same time, recognizing that even out in the wild, you know, the northern right whales, which are now very, very rare, and are living in an area that's replete with a lot of fishing debris. Those animals may live in the wild, but they are repeatedly more constrained than any animal in the zoo, because they're constantly running into netting, into bits of fishing tackle that constrain their movements and keep them, I suppose, in a kind of closer kind of confinement than any aquarium tank.
Something I wanted to mention as well for anyone who hasn't read the book yet, that I didn't realize before reading it, was that you know, often I just feel uncomfortable about the prospect of zoos or animals in enclosures, full stop. But obviously one of the most common defenses to that practice in general is for like rehabilitation and repopulation purposes. And I didn't realize that no whale bred in captivity has ever been like successfully released back into the wild. Like, there are the whales that we do keep in captivity are not for repopulation purposes. That was
I mean,
so shocking.
One of the things that ended up on the cutting room floor throughout the process of editing was like just how horrific the way that we manage these whales' sex lives in captivity is. Like, we breed them for the purposes of, you know, keeping well, this was up until quite recently. SeaWorld has stopped doing this now. But we breed them for the purpose of repopulating captive populations rather than wild ones. There's something terrible about, like, there's an aquarium in Maine, I think, where you can go and you can get married in front of the beluga tank. All these glamorous photos of like brides and grooms having their romantic milestone measured with, like, you know, a hilarious beluga behind them making a face. And it's just awful to think that that animal is living under such, you know, bereft conditions and impeded psychologically, and yet it's a kind of totemic thing that we can use to sex up our wedding photos. It's awful.
Yeah. Okay. I want to leave the conversation about captivity. We talked about hearing a reading from you, which I would love to ask you to read now. And if you want to, I guess, explain where that sort of reading comes in, and I would love for us to hear that, and then to talk about some of the mysteries about, I guess, whales. And I just loved the way your book respected obviously all the things that we know about whales, but also all of the things that we just don't know, and how that mystery and is like an inherent part of not just whales, but the whole under the sea world. And I also just want everyone who's listening tonight to have a chance to hear how you've written this book.
Thank you. You've picked a section of the book which really uses a lot of lyric language, which I appreciate, but there are a few words that I will just pick out to make sure people are across. One is that the passage references Rachel Carson, who was very famously one of the scientists who popularized ecology with her book Silent Spring. So she is a figure in this section. It also refers to a creature called an amphipod, which is like a tiny little crab, flea-sized crab. They're quite magic. If you have a chance to, like, Google image search amphipods, they're beautiful little glassy organisms at any length. Whales eat them. They also eat the skin of whales. Is there anything else you need to know? Oh, and I'm also calling back to, there's a phrase, gaze out to sea and back in history, which is lifted from a sign that I've just seen nearby the wharf, where I'm about to embark on a whale watching eco tour. Okay. What environment was ever more shielded from our collective imagination than the underside of the sea surrounding Antarctica? Unlit omnisphere, far-fetched, white noise, ice shifting, krilling, trundled by see-through salps, orbital sponges, and other questionably animate organisms, the seabed shilly-shallies into murk, lacking all tactility and aspect. No writer in good conscience could reach for a word like terrain to detail it. A void. The Southern Ocean is galactically dark, a mirror for the Vantablack of the cosmos. And yet there's an allure to this space, an allure connected to the whale's spellbinding charge, and it has to do with why many of us have been drawn out on the tour boat. We have come to be put in touch with a vaster world, one that exceeds human dwelling, if not human influence. We long to make contact with a wildness without. Writing in the Baffler, Barbara Ehrenreich has observed that contemporary wildlife tourism sells something that, quote, people have more commonly sought through meditation, fasting, and prayer. Whale watching companies from Sydney to Baja promise whale-mediated spiritual experiences. As environmental degradation grows to be a source of widespread anxiety, seeking encounters with animals from remote habitats dramatizes a distinctly modern yearning, the urge to feel oneself minified and mystified by wilds where nature remains demonstrably sovereign, abundant, and vigorous. If this is not quite the sort of spiritual hunger Ehrenreich is referring to, then it seems to me to be a keenly psychological one. We ache to meet the limit of the human world and look past it. gaze out to sea and back in history. People once feared there was a terrible existential emptiness in the ocean, an unpeopled and unending openness. In antiquity, cartographers populated the seaward frontiers of their maps with drolleries. Hand-drawn pictograms, drolleries are whales hybridized with sea serpents, their monsters adorned with antlers and tusks, scales and sprigs of feathers. Inheriting an Aristotelian fear of the void, the ancient Greeks suspected that the sea might go on forever, just like the sky. And medieval mapmakers used drolleries to enclose the known world and to indicate where nautical knowledge gave way before a front of myth. It made sense to find whales cavorting in this habitat, crisscrossing the line between rumour and fact. The conviction that every terrestrial creature would be revealed to have an inverted underwater twin meant that mariners' descriptions were routinely twisted to affirm comparisons with land animals. A pod of narwhals, for example, each sporting a single pointed horn, might be recalled as a gigantic swimming porcupine. Whether whales were natural animals or fantastical beasts, few people of this era could claim with authority. On the fringes of the ancient void, whales shapeshifted, thrashed, and fought. Cetaceans long resisted surveillance to such a degree that even as late as in the 1950s, Rachel Carson could be found writing that whales arrived in coastal currents, quote, having come from no one knows where, by no one knows what route. At this moment in time, we fear the opposite of those early cartographers, for we fear there is no void, no part of the planet untouched. This fear intensifies on hearing of plastic shopping bags that are picked over by pallid flea-sized amphipods, the only ghouls so versatile. A powerful, creeping horror, these debris fields in the deeps. Our hunch is that what lurks beyond the edge of the mapped territory is now neither a host of exotic drolleries nor large enchanting wildlife. There instead lies the dross of our everyday lives, a haunted house never inhabited but nonetheless built by our hands. This loss of containment destabilizes not just how we see nature, but also our sense of self. Were we the monsters of trespass all along, closing down the dominion of the wild?
Thank you. How does the deep ocean and how do whales make you feel?
That is in fact, an amazingly nuanced question. I'm just trying to think of the most thoughtful way to rise to meet it. What I love about whales is it draws my attention outwards to a vaster world. And I think, you know, what has made whales so compelling in human culture is that they are considered like us to the extent that they're mammals and they're warm-blooded and they nurse their young and they potentially have songs and languages. And yet they're furnished by these senses that are so alien. Some of them are perhaps sensitive to the magnetic forces of the planet. They seem capable of singing across whole ocean basins. An individual whale can live for 200 years. And I think a whale for me is a kind of opportunity to expand, you know, my sort of sensitivity to the world and understand that there are many more dimensions to the world than those that I experience. And yeah, I guess what I find most compelling about them is that they're these creatures that live in vastness. They have an evolutionary history that runs back 50 million years, like way longer than human beings do. And so we've lived with them for so ever long as we've been human. Yeah, so I think it's really that opportunity to think outside of my own reality, my own bubble.
The feeling I get is like we're like looking at the stars, where there's just like, there's a lot about it I know, there's a lot about it I don't know, but I just like how it makes me feel small.
Yeah, that's it, the minified and mystified, you know, and that's a rare emotion to experience now. We're much more likely, in terms of environmental feeling, to feel like we are constantly exceeding our borders, you know, like our trace is all, you know, even the everyday things that we use end up in the deep sea and in the bellies of whales. And so I guess we hunger to feel ourselves small again. And nothing, you know, so effectively achieves that. It's like the opposite of what used to be called the sublime. Like it's an opportunity to feel yourself cognitively overwhelmed, physically overwhelmed. Yeah.
In talking about mysteries, like you mentioned at the very beginning of our chat this evening, for example, that we still don't quite know, for example, why whales beach themselves, either as individuals or sometimes in groups. Can you talk about any of the other sort of just these big question marks we have? And what I want to know in particular is whether or not there are any sort of unanswered questions about whales that most sort of, that you are most curious about, that you wish that you knew the answer to.
Yeah, whales are incredibly mysterious animals. I mean, there are species that we know just by a handful of bone fragments or by a skull. It's only like 2016, there was this whale skeleton that was hung in an Alaskan high school, been hung there for decades as a mascot for a basketball team. Scientists decided to do a DNA test on it, and they found it was a wholly new species of whale, a whale species that didn't have a name. And so we're still discovering these animals, like they are cryptic, you know, that there may be animals as large as a bus out there that we've never seen and have never encountered and haven't yet given a name to. And that is sort of magic. But one of the most compelling stories to come out in the research, I think, which is yet to be proven, but I think would be wonderful to know an answer to, it has to do with some of my favorite kinds of whales, which are beaked whales. Beaked whale is kind of like a dolphin. It has a sort of porpoise-like beak, but they're much larger, and they tend to live out in the deep sea. And the males of some species of beaked whale have really interesting skulls. They seem to be, you know, they have these strange ridges on them and bumps, and they're kind of core-fluted, and they look like you know, these amazing asteroids. They've been dented, and for a long time, scientists haven't known why. What would be the evolutionary advantage in having a skull that was so distinctly shaped, and why is there a gender difference between the females and the males? It doesn't bear upon the brain in any way. And recent papers have theorized that actually what might be happening is that because these animals live in the dark and in the deep sea, and they use echolocation to find their prey and sound to communicate with one another, what they may be doing, the males at least, is bouncing sound waves off one another and effectively seeing underneath the animal's skin. So they see one another's skulls by bouncing back these sound waves between the tissues of the head all the way down to the bone. And in that case, these shaped skulls are effectively operating in the same way as like reindeer horns do. They're a display of dominance. They're like, you know, that they're a kind of, even though they don't use them to fight with, they potentially are a kind of like competitive courtship role. And the idea of an animal being able to like see one another's skulls, you know, or to what extent does see mean when you're talking about reception of sound as opposed to visual senses? I'd love to know more about that. Yeah, and I mean the other sort of big scientific questions now are around the ecological function of whales, because you know, when I started this book, I imagined that whales were, you know, a marine creature. They belong to marine food webs. When they die, they descend into the deep sea and they get kind of picked over by this bewitching bestiary of deep sea organisms at any length. I had no idea that whales were so connected to the chemical composition of the air which is one of the sort of recent bits of science to do with the ecological function of the whale that's stupefying, basically, because whales, the manure of whales effectively catalyzes the growth of plankton, and plankton are the world's kind of biggest displacement and absorption entity for CO2, so for fossil fuel emissions and otherwise, and they emit a huge amount of oxygen. So the more whales there are in the sea, and they sort of feed at depth, and then they come up to the surface and they defecate at the surface, the more manure there is, the more this plankton just kind of like booms. And the lives of these, like the world's biggest animals, turn out to be in this exquisite balance with the world's tiniest plants, and that affects the chemical composition of the air, to the point where some scientists are even arguing that we should include whale conservation in the Paris Agreement, because their function is as a kind of climate offset, like a benign form of geoengineering. And I think increasingly, as the old-fashioned way of looking at animals as like charismatic, totemic creatures falls away, the ecological function of large megafauna is going to be the future grounds upon which people argue for their conservation.
Fantastic. For everyone listening at home, I only have time for 2 more questions for Rebecca before we'll go to some audience questions. So if anything's come up, please remember to type them in the chat box. I made, as I was going through, I just highlighted some of the words that I'd never seen before. And they include, and I'm going to mispronounce half of these. And I don't mean, and I should say, I don't mean to read this list to sort of spook anyone playing at home, because truly unfamiliar concepts were always explained, and the ones that I don't know how to pronounce often were just obvious because of context. But I think it's fun to hear them all. Pluripotent detritivore, which I also feel like is a really good slur now. I'm just putting in my pocket.
It sounds Shakespearean, doesn't it?
Detritivore. Yeah, I love it. Defaunation, peregrination, chthonic, pellucid, semaphore, Newman, anthrophony, necropsies, which you mentioned earlier, the animal equivalent of an autopsy, tropopause, the one I think is most made up, neozoons, bituminized, and smolts. And the reason I just wanted to, I guess, read that list, and perhaps it's because I'm curious as a writer, is that, you know, you do a lot of nature writing, and I was wondering, like, I'd never encountered so many of these words before, and I feel like there must be some kind of special overlap in a Venn diagram in which you exist, where you are a writer, and I think you're a fantastic writer, and you get to come into contact with all of these, what are essentially new words because of science. And
they're all scientific words, those ones that you've read, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I just was wondering if you had anything you could share with us about the practice of combining science with writing, you know, and how you mentioned that the passage that I asked you to read was a particularly lyrical passage. Like, do you find great joy in you know, like balancing those two worlds? Do you love every time you come across a new word? Yeah,
I'm a word hoarder. When I started this book, I thought mistakenly that it would be a work of science communication. And by that, I mean, there are lots of books in the market, you know, they're in your local bookstore under the science section about physics or about math or about biology, that are essentially taking quite complex scientific subjects and rendering them lucid for the public sphere. So, you know, losing that language and creating a kind of transparency. And I started the book with that in mind, but that's not my sort of natural proclivity. I believe that scientific fact doesn't just enter the public sphere like in one direction, kind of unilaterally. Once it becomes clear, people accept it. I think if the climate debate has shown us anything, it's that science is filtered through story. And people have pre-existing cultural narratives that form a kind of topology upon which science falls and grows or doesn't grow. And so I wanted to write from within a science curious, science literate readership, which is my back. Like, I'm not a scientist. I don't have a science degree. It's not, you know, it's not my background, but I wanted to bring together narrative, some degree of poetry and science. And the way to do that was to kind of like grab the language from science that is evocative, you know, like a word like neozoon, which most scientists have probably like never kind of spent time digging into, or tropopause, which is a belt of the atmosphere. It's a poet's word. It's inherently a poet's word. And I wanted to preserve some of that in the language that I use. And really, you know, after fighting with the book for about a year, right at the very beginning, I had one day actually at the State Library of New South Wales, I will tell you, sitting downstairs, it was blindingly hot, near the time capsule. There's a time capsule down there, vivid memory. And I was working on the section in the very beginning of the book, which is about a whale fall. It's about a whale's body decomposing as it descends into the deep sea. And it just so happened that my friend Aidan Rolfe, who's an amazing Sydney poet, happened to be in the library in the same day. He walked past, said hi, and he sat on the desk opposite to me. And I just thought, you know what, I'm going to try and write this bit of science the way Aidan would write it. I didn't try and write it like poetry on this hot day in the library. And once I had that, I was like, that's what the whole book needs to be. It needs to have this sensibility. It needs to have some kind of magic in it, because that's what draws people in. And yeah, and that's I guess, you know, my natural kind of go-to as a writer is finding the sort of the evocative language. Yeah, so hopefully this is a book that kind of crosses between science and nature writing, but it also has elements of you know, the spiritual to some extent as well. Even though I'm
philosophical.
Yeah, the philosophical and the psychological. It's a real, I mean, for a debut, it really, it took me a long time. It took me 6 years to write this book, and I took 2 6-month breaks during that period. So, yeah, it was a struggle to find the right voice. But this is where I've landed.
Well, I think you found it. My final question for you is sort of a tone with which you finish the book, sort of, I guess, more than a specific question. And something I find with a lot of what I guess a broad kind of category of nature writing, whether it's as a book or whether it's, you know, just sort of essays that I read online, or even if it's news reports, is that if it's about nature, I just end up like feeling mad at humans, you know, and with a sense of downness. And like what you mentioned before, when I just think about the enormity of the climate emergency and finding it difficult to even find a particular thing to latch onto. But you very clearly wanted to finish the book with a sense of hope. And so I wanted also to finish this evening on that tone. And I suppose the general umbrella question I have for you is why how and why you have hope.
Yeah, so by the time I finish the book, I hope the feeling that you leave with is that, you know, a whale is a wonder, not just because it's the largest animal on the face of the planet, but because it has the potential to augment our moral capacity. It teaches us to care for things that exist outside our everyday sphere, things that are not even quite within our sphere of action, but are very much in our sphere of influence because of the effects that we're having on the environment. And in the future, we will be called to care for things, many different kinds of things that lie outside our immediate world, be that future generations or people overseas or other species. We are going to need to learn how to care for the distant and the unmet thing. And I think that's what whales kind of give to us. We have a model already for what it means to act on behalf of and to empathetically engage with something that is wild and wonderful and which we may never meet.
There was an incredible line that I just want to leave everyone with, where you wrote that whales give us things to be hopeful about rather than necessarily things to be hopeful for.
Yeah. And also, like, hope is in the doing. Like, it's not, I think a lot of people come to me sometimes, you know, friends and what have you, and they're like, oh, I can't, I feel so depressed about it all. I feel like I can't rise to the occasion. I've lost my hope. And my response to that is always like, what are you doing? Because you don't get to be hopeful until you make yourself useful. And you make yourself useful, you know, in a way that no one's going to change the sea as a whole. People are going to find a part of the problem that they can carve off, that they can, using their talents, their resources, their privilege, make some action around. So, you know, it's a moment where we all have to find that, because hope is fellowship, you know, it's being with other people in the battle.
Thank you. Sam, I've left 4 minutes. Oops, broke my promise. Help myself.
That's okay, Bri. We factor it in. It's all good. I do have a few questions for you, Rebecca. I think I'll just go in chronological order. Olivia says, firstly, thank you so much for this absolute masterpiece. I've never read anything close to this genre before, the mix of philosophy, science and nature. And she asks, were there any authors you were inspired by when it came to form?
Lovely question. So I tend to read, you know, I read for content. So I was reading a lot of archival stuff and scientific stuff in the process of researching this book. And then I'll read a little bit for style. But in many cases when I'm reading for form, it's coming from some other genre, actually. And so some of the books that were really helpful for Fathoms were not natural history books. One in particular, there's a wonderful memoir called The Hare with Amber Eyes by Edmund Duvall. And I was really stuck with the structure of Fathoms. At the beginning, the first chapter. Anyhow, somebody lent me that because they said to me, oh, this is a book with beautiful bones. And when I read that book, you know, it's a family history. It's about objects, not about animals. But my goodness, it just structurally, it's got, in terms of form, it's got such a, such beauty in the way that it's formed. So that was an influence. But in terms of nature writing, you know, the lodestars in this universe are Robert Macfarlane, Helen Macdonald. I really love a British poet called Rebecca Giggs, who works mostly in kind of dark ecology. She writes poetry about witchcraft and nature, which is very compelling. So yeah, and there's some great journals as well. Emergence magazine is a very good place to start to find all these writers.
Thank you. I've got another question here. Thank you for a brilliant session. Linked to the talk about words, writing and science, has Rebecca thought about working with young scientists so they can better communicate their essential work?
Ooh, good question. I always, when I interview scientists, I always try to pair my interview with one younger person and one senior person. So, and this is just because of the way that the professionalization of science works. The more senior you are, by the time you're like an emeritus professor in a discipline, you may have started out as an ichthyologist, like a fish scientist, but by the time you finish, you're a specialist in the gills of a particular species of fish in a particular lake in a particular historical period. Like, you become more senior by going narrow. So as a writer and a journalist, it benefits me to have some much more global conversations with junior scientists to start with before I go to talk to senior people. And so I've tried in many cases to like seek out those people and establish strong relationships with them, because in many cases they're just getting started in their careers as well, and it benefits them to sort of have an opportunity to have their work relayed into the public sphere. But the other thing is, I think, you know, scientists don't necessarily need to communicate their work better. It's not like we shouldn't sort of burden scientists with the role of communication necessarily. It's a relatively recent thing that scientists have been put in the spotlight in this way. There's a need for better science journalism, absolutely. And there's some wonderful initiatives in Australia. Science Now, I think, is a new interface for science writing in Australia, well worth checking out. But ultimately, my role is as a writer, and I don't have a sort of educational agenda. So, you know, my pursuit is doing books like this, doing journalism and essays like this, and that's where my resources and my time is going to go in the future.
That's where you're communicating. This is the final question, and it's a cracker. I really like it. What's your favourite thing about whales?
I was going to ask that question, but then I felt like it was like asking Mozart to play me Happy Birthday on the piano.
No,
so,
I can very simple question, expecting a big answer.
My favourite kind of whale, which is to talk this question slightly, is something called the strap-toothed beaked whale. It's very rarely seen in the flesh, but it's a large whale, the size of a hatchback. It is got that sort of porpoise-like beak, like all the beaked whales do, but it's coloured in the same way as a panda bear. So it's black and white, piebald coloured. And the males have these very distinctive tusks that grow out of the lower jaw, and they're sort of flat, like a tongue depressor, you know, you'd use to look at the tonsils. They're flat, two of them. They come up from the lower jaw, and as the whale ages, they curve around the top beak. And so this whale, as it grows older, has to learn to hunt smaller and smaller squid because it can't open its mouth as wide as it used to. And they must become more and more agile hunters. And by the end of their life, they're sucking down squid as though they were noodles because they can only open their mouth so far because of these tusks that have closed them. So that's my favorite whale. It's amazing.
That's awesome. I think what was really great about that was mine and Bri's faces.
Preserve it for posterity, yeah.
That was great. Thank you so much. That's our questions for this evening, Bri. I'm going to throw back to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. I loved this book so very much. I'm thrilled that part of my work with the library is that I get to just pick whoever I want to talk to and talk to them about their books. And for everyone who hasn't read it yet, I'm sure they will absolutely be swayed. They can get it on all good bookstores and from the State Library of New South Wales bookstore. It's the big orange book about whales. Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me. That was such a wonderful set of questions, and to the audience as well.
And for everyone, our regular B-List Book Club attendees, the next evening is the 29th of October, and we are going non-fiction again. We'll be talking to Patrick Mullins about the trials of Portnoy. 50 years after the event, here is the first full account of an audacious publishing decision that, with the help of booksellers and readers around the country, forced the end of literary censorship in Australia. And I do believe that Patrick Mullins also wrote the book that won the biography award. Yeah, Sam is nodding. The Tiberius with a Telephone. So obviously an incredible, fantastic writer. And this book, to my mind, is like the perfect combination of sort of literary world gossip and Australian history by an incredible Aussie non-fiction writer. And I'm really looking forward to it. And that's all for this evening. And just another huge big thank you to State Library of New South Wales and of course to you, Rebecca. Thank you and have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.